Good morning, everybody. This is Gary Alley. I'm co-pastor at Narkis St congregation with Danny Kopp. Our congregation meets here in Jerusalem in Israel. And this is going to be our third Shabbat that we are meeting virtually online in the midst of the quarantine of the pandemic that's going on around the world. And during this time, we still want to continue to foster community, even though we're separated physically and aren't meeting in a building. As you know, it's often said, the church is not a building, it's people. So each one of us out there on the internet, we make up that church. Each one of us is a stone in this virtual church that we're having right now. Just some things that are going on in our community. Last night, we had a prayer meeting, a Zoom prayer meeting, and we're looking to continue these types of activities to foster the community and to help people meet together during these times. So there might be many prayer meetings going on Zoom. There might be other groups meeting related to our congregation. So please be in touch, and we'll see what's going to happen here in the future as we wait out this virus outbreak. This Shabbat, March 28th, 2020, we've got the Bible study and the sermon coming up. The Bible study this week will be on Luke 6, verses 1 to 11. And Yoni Garish, a well-known Israeli tour guide here and a longtime Bible teacher, will be giving the lesson. And he's going to be looking at this story, this very interesting story of Jesus and his disciples walking through the grain fields, picking and eating the grain kernels, and being questioned about if they could do that on Shabbat or not. And the sermon is a continuation of this Lenten series that we've had going on here the last few weeks about the purpose of suffering in God's redemptive plans. And Jesus, of all people, represents that, and how he's now going up to Jerusalem and he's going to have his last Passover with his disciples before he goes to the cross. So we're looking forward to both of those for this Shabbat service. I just want to end this morning with a little encouragement during this time of the pandemic. This afternoon, the world currently has over 500,000 documented cases of the COVID-19, and over 24,000 people have died. And right now, there's not a foreseeable end in our near future of this pandemic. And here in Israel and in other places in the world, a lot of us are locked down. We're in quarantine and we're isolated. And in our case here in Israel, we're not allowed to leave our homes now. The restrictions say you can go within a 100-meter radius of your home, I guess, to walk a dog or walk a child who's going stir crazy. And there's a couple other exceptions, like to buy food or to get medicine or see a doctor. But as we're being forcibly separated in order to starve out this virus, unfortunately, our relationships are being starved out as well when we can't gather together. And everything seems to be forced online. Our schools for the kids have gone online. They call it distance learning, and a lot of work is now online. Our church right now is online. And most importantly, our relationships have become distance relationships online. And one of the most important aspects of having a strong and healthy relationship is trust. In order to know someone and for them to know you personally and transparently, you've got to have trust. Trust is critical, but it takes time to get trust. You've got to earn it. Jesus said, "Do unto others as you would have done unto you." So you don't just trust anyone and they just won't trust you. You've got to experience it together, and you've got to earn it by the way you treat each other, by the words you say, and especially during these distance relationships, the words we write. Even emojis and GIFs need trust. Now, if two of you have a long-term relationship, there's a large margin for disagreement, a large area where you can debate because you trust each other. But if your relationship is not so long-standing and you don't have that trust, we have to be more careful with what we say to one another. And that takes wisdom to know when to say something or how to say something, or even more importantly, if you should say something. Sorry, Twitter. Right now with the coronavirus, there's a lot of noise out there on the internet. We all want the truth on why this is happening and what we should do about this breakout. But it's proven difficult for many of us to find the truth because there's this inherent suspicion in the world over our sources of information. Who do we trust? I find this especially true in the body of Messiah. The followers of Jesus have become so divided in our opinions that we live in this age of fake news. And depending on our politics, our theology, our personalities, or what God told us over breakfast this morning, we choose who we believe wholeheartedly and those people that we don't believe. Yes, we know Jesus said the truth will set us free, but what if we aren't sure what the whole truth is? What if we're looking through a glass darkly or dimly, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13? And I think this is where wisdom comes in. God's wisdom for us on this earth in our human existence is this continual pursuit of the truth. First off, this heavenly wisdom is built on humility, admitting I don't have the full picture of the truth right now. As I'm walking towards understanding it more, I don't grasp it all. I don't hold it all. And when I can say that, I am empowered by wisdom to say I don't know or understand everything. Another part of the Lord's wisdom is grace. That's an aspect of wisdom that allows others to disagree with me, and I don't beat them over the head with my opinion of the truth. That grace allows me to give others the benefit of the doubt as well. It lets me to try to understand in a deeper way where they're coming from and why they're saying what they're saying. Another aspect of God's wisdom is self-control. Choosing when is the appropriate time to speak or when I should be silent and listen. As James 1:19 says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Sorry, Twitter. When I have this wisdom, this trust, this self-control, I don't need to justify myself with my words. I don't need to be right. It's okay to be wrong, in fact. We all make mistakes. We're all human. But instead, I trust the Lord to take care of the situation, even this situation now with the pandemic. Proverbs 3:5 says it very bluntly. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. I think these are three pillars of wisdom. This week, we need to be asking the questions, how do I build our trust? How do we build our trust with God? How do we build our trust with each other in community, and especially now in virtual community? Trust is the key to those relationships. So I want to encourage us this week to reach out to someone and actually talk to them with our voices. And let's build trust and let's build relationship. Our journey on understanding the truth will never succeed if we cannot begin to extend trust, even if just a little bit. So too, our community, if it wants to grow, will never mature unless we can find ways to build trust. During these days of the COVID-19 outbreak, as we seek the truth, to know what the truth is out there and to understand it, and to understand what's the Lord speaking and saying at this time, we should remember that love of others is part of walking in the Lord's wisdom. It can be hard to love others, especially those with whom we disagree. Yet how we speak the truth becomes part of the truth we share. Let's end with these words from James. James chapter 3, verses 13 to 17. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfishness in your hearts, do not boast and tell lies against the truth. Such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. But where there is jealousy and selfishness, there is disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom from heaven is first pure. It's peace-loving. It's gentle. It's accommodating. It's full of mercy and good fruit. It's impartial and sincere. So, Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you later.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house as he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Why suffer? Jesus knew he was going to die, but apparently he knew it was going to be a brutally painful death as well. He was the Messiah. Couldn't he have avoided it? Why does God allow suffering at all? There are simple answers to these questions, the ones we tell our children, the ones we usually even tell ourselves. Suffering and pain exist because there is sin in the world. Jesus had to die because there had to be payment for sin. Humans need Christ's example to learn sacrifice, repentance, and redemption. Those are simple truths we live by. They provide us with a certain logic that helps explain what to do with the problem of pain. Until some specific life circumstance overwhelms us, and you find a simple answer doesn't suffice. It just isn't enough. Does that sound blasphemous? Does it sound weak? Or maybe it's true, but it just isn't helpful or uplifting. So why bring it up here in a sermon of all places, where people come to be fed, to be encouraged? Well, you might find some encouragement in this message, but you'll have to suffer through it with me a bit. So, every day when trying to get my oldest to sit down and read a good book, I have to admit to myself and to him that I hated reading when I was a kid too. I hated it. I was terrible and slow at it, still am. So I didn't. And it wasn't until my final year of high school that a new English teacher came to teach us English literature when things began to change. All I can think of are cliches, but it was that dramatic. I was seeing in black and white until that point, and suddenly everything came on in color. A whole new world opened up to me, and I just fell in love with literature. And one of my greatest delights at that time was discovering that the Bible was actually a serious work of literature. I was shocked. I had always wanted to love reading the Bible, but of course, it just was as painful as any other reading. In fact, it was even worse because the older you get, the more complex life becomes, the harder it can be to relate to a story that's simplistic in its two-dimensional characters. Heroes who always know exactly what the right thing to do is, and evil people who have no redeeming qualities. I knew life was more complicated than that. And so, of course, I discovered that the biblical narrative had all that complexity too. Some of the struggles and inconsistencies that our Sunday school classes glossed over are right there in the text. And they're often exactly what make those stories real and relatable, and ultimately just as redemptive. One such Sunday school version of a biblical narrative that I think we've all amended since childhood and have had layers of complexity added to it was the one that went like this. The prophets had always spoken of a Messiah, an anointed descendant of King David, who would come and supernaturally restore the kingdom and justice and righteousness in the land. But when Jesus came, the Jews mostly failed to recognize that he was a promised Messiah because they mistakenly believed his principal purpose was political and were therefore unwilling to acknowledge his universal spiritual message. So this movement spread around the world, and Jews were left out, shut out, because they misread and misunderstood their Bibles. Of course, Christians and Jews have been telling each other they've been misreading their Bibles for centuries, but it's possible that the world Jesus entered was far more fluid and complicated, a world in which there was still a debate over which books to include in the Bible and which to leave out. The Jewish world that Jesus entered was vibrant and diverse and developed vastly different ideas on a range of fundamental issues. One of those fundamental issues was how to explain God's judgment. A traditional view understood God to actively intervene on behalf of those who follow him and against those who disobeyed him. For support, one could easily cite a simple reading of Leviticus that said, "If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands," the Lord says, "the people will get rain, crops, peace in their land, etc. But if you will not listen to me and carry out all these commands, then the people will be cursed with sickness, famine, military defeat, coronavirus, etc." I probably shouldn't have said that. But over time, as Israelite kings and kingdoms would fall, often sometimes seemingly due more to the capricious and unruly character of the individual kings themselves, or even just as a result of the arbitrary whims of larger neighboring rulers, many would lose faith in the monarchy and refuse to see the king and the state of his rule as a barometer of the people's spiritual well-being. In other words, if the king was defeated in battle against the Syrians, the people said, for example, it might not be because God is angry with us. Maybe he's angry with the unjust ways this king has ruled over his people. Maybe God is angry that the king has relied on his political alliances with foreign empires to secure his fortunes, when he should have relied on God's promises to maintain the security for the nation. Many of the prophets, beginning with Isaiah and Hosea, spoke critically of the unjust practices of the Israelite rulers in just this way. By the time Jesus began his ministry, it had been over 500 years since a legitimate king from the line of David had sat on the throne. It led many to question how it could be that the righteous sometimes suffer. Tzaddik veralo. Essentially, the entire book of Job was devoted to resolving that vexing question. Lamentations and Ezekiel, writing in exile in Babylon, dealt with this extensively. Ezekiel famously remarking, "The parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge." But then, suddenly in 175 BC, Antioch Epiphanes becomes king of the Seleucid Empire, stretching across a vast territory in what is today Iran, Iraq, over to Syria, Turkey, Jordan, and tiny Israel. Antioch Epiphanes, whose assumed name means manifest God, insists on imposing draconian religious restrictions upon his subjects, prohibiting them from practicing their religion. This is especially onerous for the Jews living under his rule, many of whom refuse to consider this an option. The repression against those who refuse to comply is brutal and unprecedented. These people feel acutely that they are the first generation to suffer, not just despite their righteousness, but because of their righteousness. As my professor Israel Knoll put it, those who insisted on studying Torah, circumcised their sons, refused to worship false gods. Dafka, they suffered. It was precisely them who were tortured, killed, and burned for keeping the commandments. On the contrary, Hellenized lawbreakers who would not keep the commandments of Torah, they received their reward and royal honor. It was difficult questions on suffering from a place of crisis such as these that led to new responses. First on the part of the prophets and their writings, and then on the part of the Jewish sages who interpreted the scriptures, many of whom were contemporaries of Jesus. And what they thought about God's role in people's suffering affected their expectations of a future Messiah. And just like today, they were vast and varied in Jesus' day, but getting even just a little snapshot can help provide some context. I think it's useful to start with the Sadducees, because even though they were a minority, they dominated the temple priesthood and at times the courts, and therefore wielded major influence. It's hard not to wonder if their many years in leadership made them cynical, because the Sadducees believed the ultimate ethical standard was upheld by acting righteously without expecting a reward. Now, you might think that sounds like Jesus when he said, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them." But Jesus said to do your giving in secret, then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. The Sadducees, however, believed no such thing. Not only did they not believe in life after death, as we know from the New Testament, they also did not believe that God acted sovereignly in the world, or that he acted on people's behalf in any way. They therefore were the only known sect not to have any messianic expectations whatsoever. Such hopes were futile as far as they were concerned. I find it interesting, by the way, knowing all this, Jesus never boycotts the Sadducees. He engages in vigorous debates with them, and they usually part ways unresolved. But imagine, Jesus goes to the temple regularly on the appointed occasions, knowing full well that the Sadducee priest offering the sacrifices on his behalf doesn't even believe there's a resurrection of the dead, that God may be listening to their prayers, but he certainly won't answer. Christians excommunicate each other and refuse to attend each other's services over far less significance than that. But there was another group at the time of Jesus called the Essenes, whose favorite course of action was to excommunicate those who believed differently than they did. They couldn't bear the notion that most Jews used a lunar calendar, among many other things, so they moved their entire community to Qumran, near the Dead Sea. And it is thanks to this esoteric group's unorthodox views and quarantined lifestyle that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved for us to this day. But regarding our subject, the Essenes had little grace for those who suffer specifically, because they believed in predestination, including God's preordained determination of who is righteous and who is not. There was no such thing as free will. They, the Essenes, were righteous, and everyone else was a son of darkness. That at least is roughly how some of them put it. They didn't all exactly think alike, of course, but on one issue, the Messiah, they held a lot in common. So much so that some scholars have wondered if they were an early influence on John the Baptist, who likely wandered around the desert area too. The Essenes apparently emphasized those passages from Isaiah and others that describe the Messiah as a suffering servant, and not just a metaphorical servant that represented the people of Israel suffering on the behalf of the world, but a real suffering servant as a person. Then, of course, there were the Pharisees. A hardcore of strict adherents may only have numbered about 6,000, but the Pharisees were, by all accounts, the most dominant movement among the Jewish people at the time, as their teachings were widely popular among the masses. Now, we say this often, but it bears repeating because this is a persistent misconception that Jesus and the Pharisees were polar opposites in their worldviews, that Jesus represented freewheeling spirituality as opposed to the Pharisees' rigid religious legalism. In fact, almost the exact opposite situation was the reality. Jesus and the Pharisees agreed on virtually every major theological issue, and even when they disagreed, it was usually over minor matters of degree rather than substance. What did they agree on? Well, contrary to the Sadducees' belief that God does not respond to people's actions, and contrary also to the Essenes' belief that people's actions are predestined, Jesus and the Pharisees were in agreement that God sees and cares for his people. He sends the rain on the just and the unjust, but the righteous receive their reward from their Father in heaven. Of course, they agreed on many more issues than there is time to go in here, but the major issue they agreed on, to a great degree, was on the Messiah. We know from other writings, such as the apocryphal Psalms of Solomon, which scholars have attributed to the Pharisees or to some people associated with Pharisaical streams of thought, that the Pharisees expected the Messiah to come from the line of David. And also contrary to common misperceptions, there's evidence they expected the Messiah to be divine, or to have some godlike characteristics, or exalted status of some kind. There's a verse in that Psalms of Solomon, for example, that refers to the coming Messiah as the King, the anointed Lord. But this shouldn't come as a surprise. Peppered throughout the prophets and the Psalms are references to the Messiah as the Lord, our righteousness, right? Adonai, literally, Tzidkenu. Or, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, right? El Gibor. It would have been natural for the Pharisees to follow in this vein. But it also shouldn't come as a surprise that they expected this Messiah to take the reins of government too. Specifically, they wanted a warrior king, just like David, but with superpowers. This is evident from the language in that Psalms of Solomon as well. Missing from those Psalms are references to a Messiah who is a servant, whose fate was to suffer, to bring redemption to his people, to the world. I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. You have to wonder exactly what Jesus knew about before he died. He said he wanted to eat with them before he suffered, not just before he died. He knew his death was going to involve pain, but did he know exactly what kind of pain and how much? Was he going to be able to withstand it? He must have known those messianic passages by heart, and he must have dwelt on their paradox for years. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out, or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged, till he establishes justice on the earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. A bruised and burned, quiet servant, yet nevertheless exhibiting divine judgment and wisdom. Isaiah prophesied he will not falter or be discouraged. Actually, Isaiah is rhyming there with the bruised reed and the smoldering wick to say he will not smolder or darken or be snuffed out, nor will he be crushed. His justice will be established on the earth, and distant islands will find hope in his teachings, in his Torah. But Jesus, he's arrived at the Passover, and he senses his encroaching pain and abandonment. Perhaps he senses the Spirit of God upon him, but he senses his utter weakness too. After confronting Peter over his impending denial and then getting away to pray with his disciples, Jesus no longer wants to go through with what he knows is coming. He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. And then finally on the cross, in perhaps his most painful moment, more painful than any physical suffering he endured, Jesus shouts in utter despair, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Paul says in Corinthians that he begged God to remove some painful impediment in his life, but that the Lord told him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." My power is made perfect in weakness. Earlier he says, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. He chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. Those moments of weakness, of suffering, of loneliness, of resignation in Jesus' life, they're not embarrassments. They're not lesser moments to play down. On the contrary, they brighten the picture all the more. We do not have our Messiah without his weaknesses. We don't have his full redemption story without fully embracing his despair. Instead of marching on the throne, our Messiah embodied servanthood all the way to the grave. This is a Messiah even the weakest of us can relate to, can hope in, can find strength in.